Good morning, and welcome to your morning cereal. Okay, good morning, and welcome to Friday. For some of us, that was only a 4-day work week, but why does that sometimes feel like it's a longer week? It feels a bit hard to get back to the grind. It's like when you go back to work after a long vacation. It's a heavy lift sometimes. Nevertheless, we've all made it yet again to another Friday, and it's National Sticky Bun Friday, too. So let's just make this Friday that much sweeter and grab your best friend because today is also No One Eats Alone Day. All right, well, let's go ahead and just jump into today's episode with the quotes. One fun, nostalgic quote, and then a second quote to tease our book review later in the episode. Hopefully, one of these quotes will speak to you and kickstart your day in a positive direction. All right, the first quote is from Jennifer Garner, who said, quote, "Believe in yourself and all that you are. Know that there is something inside you that is greater than any obstacle," end quote. And today's teaser quote from the book review is, quote, "Gentleness and friendliness were always stronger than fury and force," end quote. And as usual, we'll unpack those here in just a minute during the book review segment. But first, let's jump into our usual dose of fun and historic facts from this day in history. And today's news, facts, and birthdays are for February 21st. Starting way back in 1804, that's when the world's first steam locomotive ran for the very first time along a tramway in Wales. Then in 1878, the world's first telephone book is issued in New Haven, Connecticut. The directory consisted of a single piece of cardboard, and it comprised of only 50 numbers. Then, in 1885, the Washington Monument was dedicated on the grounds of the mall in Washington, D.C. Then jumping all the way up to 1958, that's when the peace symbol was designed by Gerald Holtham. Then in 1972, the U.S. President Richard M. Nixon, he paid a state visit to the People's Republic of China, and that ended a 21-year estrangement between the communist country and the United States. And surprisingly, Nixon was the very first U.S. president to visit China. Then in 1990, the Batman theme by Danny Elfman, it won a Grammy Award for the Best Instrumental Composition at the 32nd Annual Grammy Awards. Then in 1995, American businessman and adventurer Stephen Fawcett, you might remember this on the news, but he became the first person to fly solo across the Pacific Ocean in a balloon. It was the first of his many aviation records. Then in 2003, Bill Mayer's political talk show, Real Time with Bill Mayer, it debuted on HBO. And then finally, in 2004, Simon Cowell, he was set to appear in a new episode of The Simpsons, and the idle judge played a nursery boss who gets punched in the face by Homer Simpson. Well, happy birthday if today is your birthday. You share a birthday with Kelsey Grammer, he's 70 today, and Jennifer Love Hewitt, she's 46. And the number one movie on this date back in 2003 was Daredevil. It's a movie about the comic book superhero, which starred Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner, and during the filming, the two became closer friends, which eventually turned romantic in 2004. And then the number one song on this date back in 1980 was Do It To Me One More Time by Captain and Tennille. This is a great love song, and apparently the sexual tension of the song was in stark contrast to the husband and wife's very public persona of being, quote, aggressively wholesome. In fact, the husband and wife team were described as this, quote, white bread wasn't just a part of the duo's menu, it was their entire meal, end quote. Well, the duo enjoyed 1 week at the number one spot, and it was the second and the last of their two number one hits. Okay, let's move on to some personal growth in the book review segment of Morning Cereal. This is where we take a few moments to reflect on lessons learned from the current book we're reading. And as you all know, currently we're still reading through Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. It's a timeless book that is consistently on all the must-read lists, and it's packed with rock-solid advice and actions for us all to use and build healthy foundational concepts to live by. Yesterday, we began Chapter 4 of Part 3, which is entitled A Drop of Honey. And Carnegie threw us straight into the fire, suggesting we avoid the fight, we avoid the argument, avoid telling people outright that they are in the wrong, and that we should take the time to understand our differences, take time to understand the person. Then there is the likelihood that we can find some common ground to agree on. But cool heads must prevail and tact must be utilized. Carnegie reminds us that, quote, a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall, end quote. And Carnegie starts us off today by saying, quote, if a man's heart is rankling with discord and ill feeling towards you, you can't win him to your way of thinking with all the logic in Christendom, end quote. Carnegie gives two more examples of avoiding the fight. The first story relates to the account of another strike for more pay and acceptance into the union for auto workers. And at that time, and as we learned yesterday about the Rockefeller strike, these strikes could be very cantankerous and even violent. The president of the company, instead of condemning and threatening the workers in this current strike, the president praised them for being peaceful, and he bought them baseball bats and gloves, and he rented out a bowling alley for them to pass the time. Carnegie says, quote, this friendliness on the part of the president of the company did what friendliness always does. It begot friendliness. And the strikers settled in under a week and even cleaned up the grounds around the factory while they were striking. And in the second story, Carnegie cites a lawyer, Daniel Webster, that was famous for giving some of the most powerful arguments with friendly remarks like, quote, it will be for the jury to consider, or this may perhaps be worth thinking of, or you, with your knowledge of human nature, will easily see the significance of these facts, end quote. Webster did not bulldoze, he didn't pressure or force his opinions on the jury, but he used a soft-spoken, quiet, and friendly approach. For those of us that aren't company presidents or famous lawyers, Carnegie next gives an account of a man that was looking to get his rent reduced. The man wrote the landlord telling him of his intent to leave at the end of his lease, although he really wanted to stay if he could reduce his rent. And when the landlord came to visit him, the man met him at the door, quote, with a friendly greeting. I fairly bubbled over with goodwill and enthusiasm, end quote. The man looking to reduce his rent went on to compliment the building and how it was ran. And you recall from earlier in the book, he was, quote, hearty in his approval and lavish in his praise, end quote. He said he'd love to stay another year, but just couldn't afford it. And the landlord, after hearing all this, hardly even knew how to handle this nice reception. And he started to open up about his troubles with the other tenants that were constantly complaining about this and that. And the landlord found it a relief to have a tenant like this man, who was just being friendly and complimentary. And the landlord offered him a rent reduction to entice him to stay. The man said it was the, quote, friendly, sympathetic, appreciative approach that won, end quote. Here, Carnegie gave two other short accounts of how the same friendly approach gained another positive outcome. Following that, he then cites a fable about the sun and wind fighting over who is stronger. The wind blew and blew to try and get a coat off of a man, nearly reaching tornado-force winds, but the man just held on tighter. The wind eventually gave up, and then the sun came out and smiled on the old man, who wiped the sweat off his brow and took off his coat. This fable ends with, quote, gentleness and friendliness were always stronger than fury and force, end quote. And Carnegie says this simple philosophy is demonstrated, quote, day after day by people who have learned that a drop of honey catches more flies than a gallon of gall, end quote. Well, believe it or not, that brings us to the end of chapter 4, which is entitled A Drop of Honey. And Carnegie's principle number 4 is begin in a friendly way. So there you have it. And to recap thus far what we've covered in part 3, which is entitled How to Win People to Your Way of Thinking, Carnegie's first 4 principles are this. Number 1, the only way to get the best of an argument is to avoid it. Number 2, show respect for the other person's opinions. Never say you are wrong. Number 3, if you are wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically. And number 4 today, begin in a friendly way. Okay, on Monday, we'll begin chapter 5, which is entitled The Secret of Socrates. So you know that will be an interesting chapter, so join us on Monday for that. Well, you've done it. You've made it to Friday, and the weekend is just around the corner, as is warmer weather. So over the next few days, look for the opportunities to take the friendly and the high road. And we'll reconvene and share stories about it on Monday. All right, thanks for joining. Have a great weekend and have a fantastic day. Don't forget to follow and subscribe to the Morning Serial podcast on the One Life Live It channel. You can find more episodes and videos by visiting our YouTube channel and the website at Sean Inglis and at SeanInglis.com, where you can also follow our other podcasts, the Mr. and Mrs. Inglis podcast and the Life Happens podcast. In these other podcasts, we'll dive deeper into everyday issues, self-improvement and well-being, business and finance, and we welcome special guests too. So join us. It'll be a good time, I promise. Thanks again for listening. Have a fantastic day, and we'll see you tomorrow.